Hello fellas, in today's video we are going to do magical stuff in the Gearbays, so let's get started. So after the installation I made sure that the bulkheads are aligned properly by closing the fuselage halves together and making the necessary adjustments. Then I installed gearbay doors, which are molded together with part of the structure of the gearbay. The fit here is pretty decent, but it takes some guesswork, especially on the side without the bulkheads. The existence of the bulkheads makes the assembly much easier. The design can be very flawed or indeed genius if I manage not to break the bay doors by the end of the build. And that's about all of the out-of-the-box assembly around here. So let's get on with the scratch building. First, I want to do the longerons that can be found on the top of the gearbay. We will make those out of thin polystyrene sheet. The first detail will go over the seam line so that I can hide it when the nacelle halves get assembled together. One other thing that has to be taken into consideration is that the longerons have to be long enough to cover the wing section of the bay up to the molded rib detail, and with some careful trimming it all fits together nicely. Now let's create a couple of ribs that stay on the side walls of the nacelles. After measuring the dimensions of the space we have to fill, I transferred those dimensions on a piece of sheet plastic. Then, using a template with oblong shapes, I traced 3 openings on each rib. Next I made a center mark using the final diameter drill bit and started to drill the openings, making my way from the smallest to the largest drill bit. After all the drilling was done, I had to connect the holes using the scalpel blade and appropriately sized files. Finally, I cut out the ribs from the sheet and proceeded to glue them onto the side walls. On the wing portion of the gearbay we can also add some details. So let's start by creating a small bulkhead. I started by taking the shape of the nacelle and then transferred it on a piece of sheet plastic. After cutting the detail from the sheet, I trimmed it down to the proper size and glued it in place. Right next to the bulkhead, I cemented a rib. I did a couple of rivet rolls on it, but it remains to be seen whether or not this will be visible. The small bulkhead also received a few structural elements to make it look a bit busier and closer to the original. The longerons we created earlier will need their continuation on this part of the gearbay. So after carefully marking the correct position, cutting the pieces as close as possible and gluing them in place, we get a very nice and hopefully seamless transition between the different parts. Now let's add some hydraulic lines using 0.2mm soldering wire and sections of stretched Q-tip tubes for the connectors. The connectors will need to accommodate the hydraulic hoses coming from the gear legs, so I was careful to leave enough space in the tube. As usual, much care needs to be taken when working with soldering wire in order to prevent unwanted bending and other types of damage. Finally, in this area I will add a wire loom. I used the same copper wire as in the interior, but this time I twisted the wire only at one end so I could thread it into a few tube sections, which in turn will hold the loom together and will help with adhesion to the base surface. I'm pretty sure that this approach will yield a better result than the twisted looms. Next in line is the forward bulkhead. Here we start with a slightly oversized copy of an existing panel. The purpose of this seemingly pointless exercise is that we can later put one end of a hose behind this panel, which in turn will give this area a little bit more depth. The hose in question is a 0.2mm fishing line with a few tube sections on it that should resemble brackets. The fishing line is an excellent material to work with, but it has one rather big disadvantage. It is quite stiff and springy, which makes it harder to glue down, but once the glue sets, it's all fine. In order to accommodate a couple more hydraulic lines coming from the gear leg, I drill out 2 small holes, 0.3mm to be exact. Then I fabricated a bracket on which I placed 2 more holes, this time 0.1 mm or at least thereabouts. The bracket I glued above the first set of holes, and it should represent a junction between the flexible hoses coming from the gear leg and the rigid hydraulic lines mounted on the bulkhead. For those lines I used thin copper wire, which I first mounted in the holes on the bracket and then bended and superglued to the bulkhead. On the bottom of the bulkhead we can see part of what I assume is the bay door opening and closing mechanism. So using a little bit of sheet plastic and some soldering wire, I recreated this detail to some extent. The final piece in this area is some sort of a pipe or a bar that I really could not figure out what it is. But it is there and it's quite prominent, so I drilled a hole in each bulkhead and threaded a round rod section through the holes and the rib details that we created earlier. After a little bit of plastic cement, all is ready for paint. First order of business is to apply masking tape where I don't want the paint to go. In this case, the contact surfaces. Next, I brushed some Mr. Metal Primer on the copper and soldering wires to help the adhesion with the next primer layer. For the plastic bits I am using the usual suspect, Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Black, diluted with Mr. Leveling Thinner. I am going to do some bare metal chipping on the details that protrude from the body of the airplane. In this case, the gear bay doors and the immediate structure above them. This is where I assume most traffic and thus chance for paint damage will occur. The paint of choice is LP11 Silver from Tamiya. Now for the chipping I am going to use the sponge and the masking fluid technique. Not only because I had issues with the hairspray method recently, but also because the sponge/masking fluid approach gives more of a paint being damaged due to impact rather than gradual wear due to friction that the other technique gives. It is not easy to be precise with the sponge, but I'm going to try at least to be restrained in the application. Couple of things to note here. 1. It is very easy to remove the previously applied and cured fluid with the sponge due to its stickiness. And 2. Surface tension is a thing and fluids don't want to be on the raised edges, exactly where you want them to be. Now let's apply the base color, shall we? Here we have interior green over all, and given the projected visibility into the gear bay, I am not going to apply the paint in some fancy way. Just spraying it with a hint of marbling, and of course I will try to take advantage of the black primer to boost the shadows at this early stage. Aiming the airbrush from the opening of the bay door should give a good result showing the path of the light. The first step of the weathering will be some non-metallic paint distressing, using a sponge to apply a mixture of the base interior green and some buff color. I also added some Mr. Hobby acrylic thinner and a drop or two of AK drying retarder. My biggest concern with this technique is that it leaves actual texture, so I added the drying retarder with the hope that the paint will level itself. I am not convinced that it worked out, but let's move on and add some dry brushing. I am using buff oil paint, which is nicely complementing the interior green in my opinion. Usually dry brushing is considered as a highlighting technique, but here, using oils, I want to get some more out of this approach. When we are done with this step, we will have more desaturated base color, which will look much more lifelike. Also, we will get some added variation due to the movement of the brush. Now that we are done with the dry brushing, let's remove the masking fluid and see how our chipping looks like. To do the removal, I use a toothpick with cured masking fluid on the tip. For some amount of time it will be tacky enough to pull the masking away from the paint. I have to say that the results are pretty good. Not only the masking fluid is randomly distributed, but on removal it tears some of the paint away, giving some very nice effects. Sooner or later, things come down to pin wash, don't they? I chose to mix my own this time. Starship Filth and Starship Base Sludge at 70 to 30 ratio and heavily diluted with White Spirit. This is my recipe and I am very happy with it because it's not very stark, it works on a variety of colors and has this very natural looking brownish grey, dusty, dirty appearance. The wash also flows effortlessly into the recessed areas. To remove the excess wash, I gave it some 10 or 15 minutes to cure and then using Q-tips I started wiping it away. On the vertical surfaces like the bay doors, I was wiping the excess with a downward motion. And the idea is that the pigment may leave some streaks behind. To be honest, even if it did so, it is imperceivable for my eyes, but it doesn't hurt to do it anyways. Next we have to do some detail painting. It is not much, as almost all appears to be painted in the interior green. But for those details that can have some color, I will apply a layer of flat black base. Next comes some dark gray for the hydraulic connectors and the cable straps. I am applying the paint very carefully so that some of the black can show through in the recess areas. Just like inside the cockpit, I am going to use AK's Dry Light Matte color for the wire looms. This paint comes from the bottle rather well diluted, so I decided to give it a few minutes to thicken a little bit. Before we continue with some more weathering, I am going to paint some silver in the middle of the black hose clamps. This way they will become a little bit more prominent and will look much better. Now let's think about the environment and how it interacts with this area of the airplane. I'm thinking for some dusting, similarly to the cockpit, but this time concentrated on the gear bay doors and the portion of the bay that accommodates the wheel when the plane takes off. Using Tamiya's buff color, heavily diluted with Mr. Rapid Thinner, I am applying the dust layer after layer so I can gradually build the opacity and blend the effect with the cleaner areas in the same time. Initially it may look like all the previous work is being buried under this layer of dust, but instead it ties it all together and adds another layer of complexity in the whole picture. With all that work done, it is safe to say that we now have a pretty decent looking gearbase. So in the next episode we are going to tackle the landing gear where the room for improvement is quite noticeable. So give this video a like so that the YouTube algorithm can show it to more people, and come back next time for more fun with scratch building, painting and weathering. Until then, happy modeling fellas!